In the Middle Ages, a document protesting the Catholic Church was nailed to a church door. But this wasn't Martin Luther's Germany. This was England 120 years earlier. A populist group, inspired by a charismatic preacher, were trying to kick-start a Reformation. They were the Lollards. Although they failed to initiate an immediate Reformation, their ideas would be kept alive until the mid-1500s. Their inspiration was the controversial rabble-rouser John Wycliffe. We don't know much about his life. He was born in the 1320s in Hipswell, near Richmond in Yorkshire. Living through the Black Death in 1348 had a profound impact on his life. Seeing so much death and destruction convinced him that the plague was sent by God to punish the sinful church. Maybe this is why, in 1351, he went to Oxford to become a priest. He rose through the academic system, gaining a bachelor's and doctorate degree in theology. He became Master of Balliol College in Oxford, and in 1877, a new theological college, Wycliffe Hall, was named in his honour. However, it wasn't long before Wycliffe started kicking up a fuss about the religious authorities. He had a lot of strong views, and he wasn't afraid to let people know them. Starting in the 1370s, he railed against the Catholic Church with three main objections: that the bread and wine in communion was not the literal body and blood of Jesus, that the Bible was the sole source of religious truth, and that there was no scriptural basis for the papacy. He concluded that, because the Catholic Church had fallen into sin, it ought to give up all its property. This was a massive threat to the religious and political establishment. In 1377, the Pope sent a bull to England declaring his views heresy. Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Catholic Church in England at the time, brought him to trial. But political figures at the time viewed Wycliffe as a useful asset in resisting the power of the Church. Who was the Pope to demand the expulsion of an English subject? Joan of Kent, the mother of King Richard II, intervened on his behalf, and he was released. He found another ally in John of Gaunt, the king's uncle, founder of the House of Lancaster. But this brush with authority didn't stop Wycliffe, and he continued even further in his crusade. Perhaps he felt emboldened by his high-profile supporters. He placed particular emphasis on this, the Bible. We often take for granted the fact that we can pick up a Bible and read it in almost any language. That's a privilege which most people, for most of history, have not enjoyed. In the Middle Ages, the Bible was in Latin. You had to be educated in order to read it. Ordinary people weren't, so they encountered the scriptures orally, through the preaching of priests or from storytelling. But Wycliffe believed that all Christians should be able to read the Bible in their own language, and that it was the only source of truth about God. Despite considerable pressure from the religious authorities, Wycliffe set about on his lasting legacy, an English translation of the Bible. But he wasn't alone. He was aided by a team of translators. This wasn't the first time that the Bible was translated into English. We have copies from the 10th century of the Gospels in Old English, known as the Wessex Gospels. But whilst these were written and read by monks in monasteries, Wycliffe intended his to be read by the ordinary person. The ordinary educated person, that is. The translation style of Wycliffe's Bible is extremely literal and word for word. This makes it quite hard to read. They were also not working from the original Greek and Hebrew manuscripts. They were working with the Vulgate, the Latin Bible translated by St. Jerome in the 4th century. So the Wycliffe Bible was a translation of a translation. The first version, produced around 1382, renders the famous John 3:16 as this:
For so God so loved the world, that he gave his own begotten Son, that each man that believeth into him perish not, but have everlasting life.
If you couldn't make sense of all that, here it is in its more recognisable King James Version. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Wycliffe's teaching spread across the land, and his followers became known as Lollards. Lollen is a Middle Dutch word meaning mumbling, and so was an insult against those considered stupid or uneducated. Not only were they a threat to the religious establishment, but political leaders began to get worried as well. In 1381, the Peasants revolted. Stirred up by high taxes, thousands of rebels marched on London, led in part by the popular Lollard preacher John Ball. Although Wycliffe opposed the revolt, he and other Lollards became guilty by association. No longer was it just a religious issue, it was now a political one. Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury who had tried Wycliffe in 1377, was murdered by the mob. When the revolt was crushed, persecution of Lollardy swiftly followed. In 1382, Sudbury's successor convened a special synod on Lollardy. It was delayed due to an earthquake, which Wycliffe took as a sign of God's judgment. At the synod, Wycliffe's views were declared heresy. This brings us back to 1395, when a group of English knights nailed the 12 conclusions of the Lollards to the doors of Westminster Abbey and St Paul's Cathedral. Lollardy, as a movement, was an umbrella for a wide variety of views, and so this should not be taken as an exhaustive or definitive doctrinal statement. Notably absent from this list is an emphasis on the English Bible, but the 12 conclusions can be summarised as follows. 5 are about the clergy and religious orders. This was clearly a major issue at the time. It's interesting to see such a bold rejection of religious wars, especially when they were normal at the time. The rest concern the beliefs and practices of the Church, and this radical document reflects core elements of the Reformation across Europe. However, this document doesn't seem to have done anything. It was the equivalent of putting up a poster. But it's important because it shows that the movement had attracted people with power who were formulating their views and presenting them to the authorities. But the Peasants' Revolt had changed things. By the 15th century, it was difficult to be a Lollard. In 1401, John Purvey, Wycliffe's friend and translator, was forced to recant, meaning publicly give up, his Lollard views. A law had been passed which allowed heretics to be burnt at the stake. He didn't want to end up like William Sawtry, a priest executed for denying transubstantiation. He was the first Lollard to be burnt at the stake. A wave of persecution followed, and the movement went underground. The law continued to come down hard. In 1407, new translations of the Bible were banned unless approved of by bishops. This meant that they could control what people read. In 1410, the Archbishop of York, Thomas Arundel, authorised a translation of Meditations on the Life of Christ, a popular devotional work, but with commentary added which explicitly denounced Lollard beliefs. In 1414, Sir John Oldcastle, a leading Lollard, escaped from the Tower of London and attempted to start a rebellion against the king. He was eventually captured and executed. Once again, Lollardy was seen as an explicitly political threat. Regardless of what you actually believed, being a Lollard was seen as being in active sedition against the king. Predictably, further persecution followed. Wycliffe died of a stroke in 1384, but his spectre still loomed large. In 1415, 31 years after he died, he was declared a heretic. In 1428, 44 years after he died, his body was dug up, burnt, and his ashes scattered into the River Swift. It's as though, as time went on, Wycliffe's threat became bigger and bigger to the established order. Lollardy was never fully eradicated. We have court records of Lollard trials well into the 1550s, but by that point the Reformation was in full swing across Europe. Lollardy, having gone underground in the 15th century, simply became absorbed into the wider Reformation movement. So if Lollardy started so early and was such a clear influence on the English Reformation, why did it fail? Why did England not experience a full Reformation in the 15th century? The answer is, I believe, because they were simply too early. The Lollards didn't have printing presses. So it's all well and good starting a movement built around the English Bible, but unless you can actually get them into people's hands fairly quickly, it's going to lose momentum. At the time, everything was copied out by hand. It's estimated to have taken a scribe a whole year to make one copy of the Bible. What drove the later Reformation was the fact that, with the advent of the printing press, Bibles could be reproduced and spread en masse. There was also the problem that, for many, the Lollards were simply too radical. They had too often been associated with movements which directly threatened the ruling class, like the Peasants Revolt and Oldcastle's Rebellion. This made it hard to gain support among the nobility, those with the money, power and influence needed to legitimise and spread the message. Wycliffe did have a number of powerful supporters, such as Joan of Kent and John of Gaunt, but after the revolt, these figures distanced themselves from the movement. In addition, Lollardy was always very diverse and lacked central unity. After Wycliffe's death in 1384, there was no clear leader who could unify and formulate core doctrines. In some ways, a Lollard was just anyone who rebelled against the teachings of the Catholic Church. But despite these limitations, the impact of the Lollards was undeniable. As the historian A.G. Dickens summarised, the Lollards provided a springboard of critical dissent from which the Protestant Reformation could overleap the walls of orthodoxy. Lollard ideas had soaked into the land for over a century, so people were used to teachings like salvation by faith alone and the vernacular Bible. There is some disagreement over whether Wycliffe actually taught salvation by faith alone, but that's an ecumenical matter. When we look at the story of John Wycliffe and the Lollards, we see that the Reformation didn't start, as commonly believed, with Martin Luther in the 16th century. These ideas had been circulating for a long time before that, and although the Lollards were too radical for their own time, without them, England may never have experienced a Reformation at all. If you liked this video, do subscribe to stay updated and watch some of our previous ones. And why not send this video to someone who would find it interesting?